You walked away from a conversation and stared at nothing. Nothing went wrong. There was no argument, no word out of place, no conflict, no moment you could isolate and point to as the cause. The person left, and you stayed there, not sure exactly what you were feeling, but feeling that something had left with them. Heavy, empty, like someone had reached inside you and taken something without asking, and you couldn't name what it was. When that person's name appears on your phone, something closes in you before you decide anything. It isn't a choice. It isn't a conscious decision. It's an automatic, silent response your body already knows by heart. You only realize it after, when you go to pick up, that you were already bracing for something. The way you brace yourself to carry a weight before you've even reached for it. And there's the part almost no one names. The guilt that comes after. Because the person didn't do anything obviously wrong. They weren't cruel, weren't aggressive, didn't say anything you could point to with clarity. So you attribute the exhaustion to other things. To work, to a hard day, to accumulated fatigue, to anything but the conversation you just had. And you stay exposed. And the weight builds, week after week, without a name to give it, and without a tool to change it. You tried to go back to what you were doing before, but your thoughts wouldn't settle. You were less patient with the people around you, less present with the ones who matter, more shut down than when the conversation started, and there was no concrete explanation for it, because nothing concrete had happened. This is what separates draining from every other form of relational difficulty. Difficult people you know through conflict, through friction, through the word that stings, through behavior you can name and respond to. People who drain are more subtle. Sometimes they're people you genuinely care about. Sometimes they're people who have never done anything obviously wrong. But every time you finish a conversation with them, you leave with less than you had before. Less energy, less clarity, less presence for the rest of the day. The problem isn't weakness. The problem is that you were never taught to name what's happening. And without a name, there is no possible protection. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in the Meditations as a daily exercise in clarity, not for the world, for himself. And in one of those entries, he said he had to protect his inner calm with the same care he protected the empire's borders, with the same strategy, the same attention, the same awareness that borders aren't only defended against visible attacks, against declared blows, against identified enemies, because inner calm can be invaded without a single blow, in silence, through accumulation, through repeated exposure, without awareness and without tools. The Stoics identified specific patterns of interaction that consistently produce this result, along with a concrete practice for each one. These aren't general attitudes. They're not vague advice about self-care or setting boundaries. They're specific moves that operate at precise points in the draining cycle. And not one of them requires the other person to change. Not one requires confrontation. Not one requires the relationship to be destroyed in order for you to be protected inside it. There are 7, and the first one doesn't start at the moment of contact. It starts before. You already know what you're going to find before you open the message. A long voice note waiting. A text you recognize by its length before reading a word, a call that appears on the screen and already activates resistance before any decision, and you're already spending energy before the first character, before the first second of audio. The wait exists before the contact, because the pattern has repeated enough times for your internal system to recognize it with certainty. Epictetus taught that disturbance doesn't come from events. It comes from the relationship you build with them, and the draining begins the moment you decide to open without being ready, to respond without having consciously chosen to be available by default when availability should be an active decision, made with awareness, not with automatism. Filtering the input isn't ignoring, it isn't coldness, it isn't disrespect toward the other person. It's asking yourself one question before opening any message or answering any call from someone who historically leaves you heavier than you were. Am I in a position to receive this right now? If the answer is no, postponing is legitimate. It isn't avoidance. It isn't neglect. It's the only act that guarantees that when you are present, you're actually present, and not simply available on autopilot, without choice and without conscious cost to yourself. Epictetus said, "It isn't things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. And the most expensive judgment you can carry is that you need to be available for everything that arrives, when it arrives, with no criteria about the moment and the state you're in. You don't always need to be open. Openness without criteria isn't generosity. It's the absence of a limit. But filtering the input is only the beginning. because you don't always control the moment of contact. And when it happens, there's something most people never learn to measure, something that reveals the pattern with a clarity no conversation can produce. The scene is this. You were with that person. The conversation seemed normal. Nothing obviously wrong happened. No visible conflict. No word you could isolate and point to. And when they left, you noticed you're less patient, more shut down, with less energy for what you needed to do next. The draining wasn't an event. It was a state that installed itself gradually while you weren't paying attention to the process. Marcus Aurelius had the habit of, at the end of each day, conducting an examination of conscience, not only about what he had done, but about how he was. The Stoic observes the internal state with the same attention given to external events. Because what you feel after a contact is data. It's objective information. And repeated information about the same pattern is evidence. Measuring what leaves is straightforward. After each contact with that person, an internal check on 3 points. Energy level, more or less than before the contact. Mental clarity, more focused or more scattered. Emotional state, lighter or heavier. Not to judge the person. To have objective data on the pattern. When those 3 points consistently point downward across enough contacts, the decision to change stops being emotional and becomes rational. You're not reacting from impulse or from a vague feeling. You're responding to accumulated evidence. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it isn't right, don't do it. If it isn't true, don't say it." Your mind is your guide to everything, including your guide on who has access to you, in what amount, and for how long. You don't need a dramatic proof to protect your energy. The state you're left in afterward is proof enough. And when the evidence is clear, when the pattern has been named and recognized, comes the most costly moment in the cycle, not the contact itself, what you do after it, when you decide to create some distance and then feel the automatic impulse to justify every inch of that distance. This practice goes against almost everything you were taught about being a good person. That's exactly why it's the hardest one to execute. You decide not to pick up. You decide not to show up to something. You decide to take a step back in the relationship, reduce contact, create space between you and this interaction that leaves you heavy, and then the automatic impulse arrives. Explain, construct a convincing justification, make sure the person understands, doesn't feel offended, doesn't read something into your behavior that you didn't mean. The explanation grows, the justification expands, and in the end you realize the energy spent justifying yourself was greater than it would have cost to simply go. Seneca wrote that the person who needs approval for every decision is never truly free, because their freedom is in the hands of whoever approves. Explaining your peace to the person who consumes it doesn't protect the peace. It creates a permanent negotiation over something that shouldn't be negotiable. The Stoic isn't rude, isn't cold, but doesn't owe explanations for their inner calm. Replace the long explanation with a short, neutral response. I won't be able to make it. Instead of an elaborate narrative, the other person will analyze for contradictions. I need some space today, instead of 10 minutes of justification that becomes the next point of entry for the cycle. Excessive explanation isn't respect for the other person. It's fear of their reaction. And draining relationships frequently sustain themselves on exactly that fear. The fear that a limit, without detailed explanation, will generate a consequence you're not prepared to face. Peace that needs approval to exist isn't peace yet. It's a permanent negotiation. But there's a specific moment inside the interaction itself, while it's still happening, where all the protection built before can unravel in seconds. It's the moment a phrase arrives in a way you recognize, and the reaction rises before any conscious decision. That person said something, a comment that seemed innocent but arrived loaded. A critical observation disguised as concern. A phrase you've heard enough variations of to recognize the pattern, but that still triggers an automatic response before you notice. The reaction rose. It came out, and only after, when the disturbance was already installed, did you realize you had given exactly what the interaction was looking for: your attention, your energy, your destabilized state. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about the space between stimulus and response, not as philosophical abstraction, as daily practice, documented as an exercise. The space doesn't exist by default in the nervous system. It has to be created consciously, with intention, each time the stimulus arrives. The Stoic doesn't eliminate the emotional reaction. They create a deliberate pause before acting from it. 3 steps that can be executed in seconds. The first, name internally what's happening. Not out loud inside, I'm being activated right now. Just naming it creates distance between the event and the reaction. You aren't the reaction. You're observing the reaction happen in you. That's already a different position. The second, a deliberate breath before responding. Not as a relaxation technique, as a physical marker of the space being created. The body needs a concrete signal that there's a pause before action. The third, consciously choose what to do with that space. Respond or don't respond. Both are active choices, and non-reaction is often the more powerful of the two. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Whoever drains energy needs your reaction to sustain the cycle." The 3-second pause is where that cycle breaks. If you've seen the video on emotional shutdown, you'll recognize this mechanism from a different angle, because the pattern of closing yourself off to stay safe and the pattern of reacting automatically share the same root. The absence of a conscious space between what happens and what you choose to do with it. Practice 4 doesn't fill that space. It creates one where none existed before, and there's a specific case that deserves its own practice. The case where direct distance isn't an available option. You can't simply walk away. It might be a family member you see every week, a coworker you're around every day, same project, same building. No way to avoid the contact without creating a larger problem than the one you're trying to solve. Someone in your social circle who doesn't disappear without cost to other relationships that matter, and you already know that a direct conversation about this won't fix it. You've tried, or you've imagined that conversation enough times to know how it ends. The only exit that appears is to endure in silence until you hit a limit, or explode into a confrontation that will cost more than what it resolves. But there's a third option, and it's the one Stoics used most often. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire. He interacted every day with people who disturbed him, who had agendas opposed to his, who consumed his energy in ways he documented honestly in the Meditations. He didn't confront each one. He didn't remove them from contact. He managed the geometry of the relationship with awareness, because proximity is a variable, not an absolute. You can reduce access without announcing it, without explaining it, without creating a declared conflict. Distance can be built gradually and in silence, and no one needs a formal statement for it to happen. 4 levers. The first is frequency. See them less often. Not disappear, because disappearing creates the need for the explanations practice 3 eliminates. Just space it out. Weekly to bi-weekly, bi-weekly to monthly. No announcement, no drama, no conversation you already know the ending of. The second is duration. Shorter encounters. Arrive a little later when possible. Leave a little earlier, with real commitments that shorten the time of exposure, without requiring elaborate justification. The third is depth. Keep conversations in neutral territory. Don't share plans, important decisions, vulnerabilities. What isn't shared can't be used as a point of entry into the next cycle. The fourth is the channel. Replace in-person contact with written messages when possible. The distance of the channel reduces the transfer of emotional state. What arrives by text doesn't occupy the same internal field as what arrives in person. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Spend as little time as possible with people who don't build you up, not with anger. With indifference, you don't need to cut anyone out of your life to protect it. Sometimes all it takes is changing the architecture of how you meet." But there's something about the 6th practice that needs to be named precisely before arriving at it, because it deals with a form of draining that doesn't happen during contact, but after. And it's the hardest to identify because it arrives wrapped in the feeling that you're being a good person, someone present, someone who cares. That person brought a problem. A difficult situation described in detail. A complaint about something that's been affecting them for weeks. A weight they carried to you, set on the table between you, and then left. You listened. You felt it. You tried to help with what you had, with words, with perspective, with time. And when the conversation ended, their problem went with them, but the weight stayed with you. Hours later, you were still thinking about the situation, feeling a diffuse responsibility for something outside your control, a pull toward fixing what isn't yours to fix. And part of you already knew, if you reach out tomorrow, the cycle starts again from the exact same point, with the same weight, the same complaint, the same silent transfer that happens every time. Seneca wrote that there's a fundamental difference between compassion and absorption. Compassion acknowledges the other's suffering without taking it on. Absorption makes the other's suffering your problem, and you spend real energy, real time, real presence on something outside your control and therefore impossible for you to resolve. The Stoic can care deeply about the people around them without assuming responsibility for what isn't in their control. One internal question, asked before taking on the weight of any problem someone brings: is this in my field of action? If the answer is no, and it often is, the right response isn't to solve the problem. It's to listen with presence and release it at the end. You can be completely present for someone, listen with real attention, offer what you genuinely have, without becoming a permanent repository for what that person can't resolve on their own. And at the end of an emotionally heavy conversation, a deliberate act of closing, concrete, physical, something that signals to your internal system that the field has been closed and the weight returned. It might be washing your hands when you leave, a short walk before returning to the rest of the day. An internal phrase said with intention: this isn't mine to carry. The gesture isn't superstition. It's a signal to the nervous system that you were present, but you didn't become the problem. Listening isn't the same as absorbing. You can be fully present for someone without becoming a holding place for what they can't resolve. But there's one step none of the previous 6 practices take. A step that isn't about how you relate to the other person. It's about what you do with yourself. After everything has already happened, the encounter ended, the person left, but you're still carrying the residue, the tone that lingered in the air, the weight of what was said or what wasn't said but was present. The emotional state, the interaction left behind, which doesn't dissolve automatically just because the conversation ended. You try to return to what you were doing before, but something is off. And without a specific tool for this moment, you carry that residue until time dilutes it, with no deadline, no guarantee, no conscious action on your part. Marcus Aurelius ended each day with what he described as a deliberate return to himself, not as an intellectual analysis of what happened, as a reunion with what he called the rational inner nature, the baseline state, the center from which you act when you're not being pulled by anything external. And he did it consciously, actively, as a practice, not as a passive wait for balance to return on its own, because he knew balance doesn't return on its own. It's restored. 3 questions that build this return. The first, what did this interaction take from me? Not vaguely. With precision, energy, focus, mood, presence. Naming it concretely rather than feeling it generally creates distance between the state and the identity. You aren't permanently diminished. You temporarily lost something that has a name, something that can be recovered through conscious action. That distinction changes everything that follows. The second, what part of this interaction is still within my control? Clearly separating what happened, which is past and can't be changed, from what you decide to do from this point forward, which is present and entirely yours. This step prevents the episode from dragging through rumination for hours or days, feeding a state that no longer has a reason to exist beyond your continued attention to it. The third, what do I need right now to return to my state? A concrete small answer. One that doesn't depend on resolving the situation with the other person. 10 minutes of silence. A walk, returning to a specific task that demands attention and replaces the residue with active presence. The goal is a deliberate act of recentering, not a passive wait for time to resolve what only conscious action can resolve. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Retire into yourself. It is in the nature of the rational mind to be content with itself when it acts with justice, and to find their serenity. You don't have to wait for the exhaustion to lift. You can actively return to yourself." That's the difference between someone who gets swept away by interactions and someone who moves through them with their center intact. Look at what connects the 7 practices. It isn't obvious when you examine each one alone, but when you see them together, there's a logic that holds them, a logic more important than any individual practice. Not one of them changes the person who drains. Not one requires confrontation. Not one requires you to announce that the relationship is over, to give a speech about your limits, to appear visibly different from who you've always been. All of them operate at the same level. They change your relationship with the point of access. Filter the input. Measure what leaves. Don't explain your piece. Create space before reacting. Reduce access without declaring war. Don't carry what isn't yours. Return to yourself after every encounter. Each of these practices, alone, already changes something. Together, they change the entire architecture of how you're available to the world around you. And that architecture, built with awareness and with practice, is a form of power most people have never exercised deliberately, not because it's too difficult, because it was never named clearly enough. Stoicism isn't about defeating difficult people. It isn't about being stronger than them. more resilient, more capable of enduring. It's about stopping the habit of making your well-being dependent on how they behave. It's about recognizing that you can't control the people around you, but you can completely change the architecture of how you relate to them. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. Protecting your energy isn't selfishness. It's the only act that guarantees you'll still have something to give to the people who actually matter. Epictetus said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have tranquility, not as resignation, as autonomy, the peace that comes from no longer needing the world to be different than it is, just from being different in the way you inhabit it." Of the 7 practices, there's one you know you need to start tomorrow. Not all 7 at once. Just one. Write the number in the comments, 1 through 7. Because the person you have in mind while watching this video already knows something is going to change. You're the only one who still has to decide when.